There are songs in this galaxy that were never meant to be heard, melodies carried not by sound, but by vibration in bone, in soul, in the cracked hulls of forgotten moons. These are not hymns sung to gods. They are dirges offered to wounds, wounds in reality, in time, in memory. Beneath fractured worlds and beneath our own assumptions of what constitutes a cult, there lies something else entirely. Choirs of vermin, both literal and metaphorical, orchestrating an infection of sorrow and silence that the Imperium dares not name. They fester beneath the hollow moons, deep in places where even the Adeptus Mechanicus have ceased to probe. Their worship is not for salvation, but for consumption. These are not relics of the past. They are living horrors, songs that breathe, that gnaw, that bleed into the vox. Forgotten, yes, but only because forgetting them is easier than acknowledging what they truly are. Ready? Press enter to hear the next voice. In the Imperium of Man, cults are as numerous as the stars, and most are stamped out with flame and blade. But some endure, not because they are too powerful, but because they are too strange, too elusive, too alien even for the lexicon of heresy. These are not cults that worship chaos gods, or Xenos deities, or forgotten saints. These are cults that have no god at all. They gather in darkness to venerate absence, to offer themselves to nothing, to exalt the unraveling of thought and identity. Faith without an object, it is perhaps the most dangerous form of devotion imaginable. Such cults might chant to silence, or prostrate before cracked mirrors reflecting no image. Their rites are not directed toward a divine entity, but toward a principle, a mood, a collapse. In Hive Tarsus, a subcult of the Null Cantors was discovered. They wore robes of dust and brick, never spoke aloud, and instead performed rituals involving the rhythmic arrangement of broken vox units. Their goal was not to summon a presence, but to deepen an absence. They did not believe in a higher power. They believed in erasure, and their reward was nothingness. Another group, known only as the Pale Knot, operates in the shadow of dead stars. Explorator logs recovered from derelict systems describe corridors marked with endless spirals, their loops etched in blood and static. Survivors from salvage teams claim to hear nothing at all, not even the hum of their own suits. One died from what the Medicaid termed neural collapse due to excessive cognitive vacancy. The Pale Knot does not pray. They dissolve thought into structure, building shrines with no iconography, reciting litanies stripped of language. They worship decay as an event, not a symbol, and in doing so, they become a contagion themselves. These cults are not defined by ideology, but by aesthetic, a dangerous evolution in heresy. They are mimetic rather than theological. They spread not through belief, but through resonance. An acolyte of the Singularity Wayne once wrote in his suicide log, "I did not believe in it. It was beautiful, and I could not look away." That is how these cults persist, not by logic, but by allure, by compelling the mind to linger on the edge of understanding until it falls in. There is a known sect on Virex Prime called the Whispers of Dust. They engage in a ritual called the Sifting, where they walk through the irradiated bones of an extinct hive, dragging chains behind them. No words are spoken. No meaning is assigned. The sound alone is said to be enough to induce visions of past lives and future deaths. Inquisitorial observers described the cultists as philosophers of rot, yet found no evidence of chaos taint. And so the Whispers of Dust remain, not quite heretical, not quite benign, but entirely wrong. Even among the Ordos, these faithless faiths are hard to categorize. They do not fit into the neat boxes of demonic or Xenos or tech heresy. They evade destruction not by hiding, but by being unfathomable. Their threat lies not in conquest, but in influence. They erode certainty, unravel meaning. They convert not through persuasion, but through despair. And in the Imperium, where hope is a necessary illusion, That is the deepest blasphemy of all. In some cases, the cult is not even aware of itself. A pattern emerges, a behavior spreads, and only later is it recognized as ritual. The mute processions in Hive Cascor's underlevels, where hundreds of workers drag their boots in unison at dawn without command. The rhythmic blinking patterns observed in the orbital habs of Silent Reach. The choral breathing in the quarantine zones of Severum Delta. No leader, no dogma, just behavior, just infection. The Mechanicus calls it subharmonic psychological resonance. The ecclesiarchy calls it demonic influence, but neither explanation satisfies. These cults worship not through structure, but through entropy. They do not seek power, they seek unbeing. They do not cry out for miracles, they hum lullabies to oblivion. And still, they spread, because in a galaxy of fire and fury, the allure of nothing is strong. When every day is war, the quiet can sound like salvation. These cults promise release, not from pain, but from meaning. And some find that promise too seductive to resist. In the cold orbit of forgotten systems, amidst the debris fields of failed colonies and derelict stations, there linger structures known only in obscured logs and whispered rumors. The hollow moons. These are not natural satellites, nor are they thriving bastions of human habitation. They are empty husks, artificial or once living worlds gutted by time, war, or design. Their innards resonate like the chambers of old instruments, amplifying not sound, but presence, psychic echoes of sorrow, rage, and worse. These moons are found where once the Imperium overreached, where Mechanicus ambition drilled too deep or ecclesiarchal zeal burned too bright. What remains is not just ruins, but vaults of memory etched into stone and void. Explorators brave enough to enter them speak of a soundless song, a feeling in the marrow, like being watched by the dead past. These aren't haunted by ghosts. They are haunted by the weight of potential, futures that never happened, prayers that were never answered. The moons remember, and what they remember is pain. Some theorists from the forbidden margins of the Ordo Chronos believe the hollow moons are remnants of time fracturing, not in the grand, dramatic ways seen in warp rifts or temporal anomalies, but in quiet, unnoticed shatterings. Like a scream frozen in ice, these moons might be catching echoes of moments that shouldn't exist. Those who walk inside report visions of events that could never have happened, pilgrimages to non-existent shrines, battles with faceless enemies, births in cities wiped from stellar maps. And above all, they report hearing singing, not from any mouth, but from the walls themselves. The most infamous of these is the moon called Threnadex, a name not given by the Imperium, but by the cult that once called it home. A mining station turned mausoleum, Threnadex was sealed after a mining laser uncovered a chamber lined with ossified vocal cords, thousands of them woven into cathedral-like acoustics. The workers began to hum in unison. No words, just tone. The same note over and over until they starved to death or bled from the throat. When a recovery team arrived, they found the walls vibrating. They detonated the station, but even now, orbiting Vox arrays still pick up fragments of song when they sweep that sector. Another hollow moon, in orbit around the black star Vulex 9, is known to rogue traders as the Coil. Not a true moon, but a toroidal construct made of fused bone, metal, and psionic crystal. When approached, it emits subharmonic pulses that scramble machine spirits and trigger flashbacks in the minds of psychers. It is said that every 39 standard hours, it exhales, a rush of vacuum that carries with it a scream too low to hear, but strong enough to induce vomiting or euphoria. Cultists dwell in makeshift sanctuaries within the coil, many with tongues removed and ears sealed, claiming they are preparing for the resonant silence. What binds these moons together is not proximity, origin, or even function. It is the sense that they are listening. They absorb emotion, reflect trauma, echo intention. Like psychic black boxes, They archive everything that has gone wrong in their orbit and then sing it back, not as a warning, but as an invitation. They are cathedrals of entropy, built not to honor gods, but to house memory that refuses to die. The hollow moons have become pilgrimage sites for certain fringe cults, those who believe that true enlightenment comes not from learning, but from resonating with cosmic sorrow. One such sect, the Ecliptics of the Second Dissonance, describe the moons as mouths of the galaxy, open not to speak, but to inhale. Their followers gather at the edges of quarantined orbitals, listening through custom Vox rigs that mimic pre-imperial frequency ranges. Some say they have captured voices, though what is said is never intelligible, only felt. The Inquisition has attempted to catalog and destroy these moons when possible, but they are elusive. Some disappear from Auspex entirely, only to reappear years later in different orbits. Others prove impossible to destroy, with demolition charges failing to detonate, or ships falling prey to mass mechanical failure upon approach. There are even rumors of new hollow moons being born, stations gutted by civil war that begin to exhibit the same acoustic anomalies, moons cracked by meteor strikes whose exposed interiors begin to hum. They are not temples. They are not weapons. They are repositories of emotion given architectural form. And where such depth exists, cults are drawn, like flies to carrion. For in a galaxy where the divine is often indistinguishable from the insane, to find a song that sings you back is perhaps the most seductive blasphemy of all. They do not sing with voices, these vermin. Their mouths are often sealed or torn or non-existent. Yet they sing. Beneath rusted catwalks, in the crawl spaces between bulkheads, in the marrow of derelict void ships and cracked hive spires, the vermin choir weaves its song, not in melody but in vibration. It is not music as we know it. It is a waveform of infection, a dissonant frequency of despair, and once heard, truly heard, it is never forgotten. The origins of the vermin choir are unclear, and perhaps deliberately so. Some say they emerged from the failed sonic experiments of the Mechanicus. Others whisper that they are the legacy of a vanished xenospecies, whose language was nothing but tone. The more poetic among the Black Library archivists believe the choir was born in a moment of mass grief, an entire planet's death agonies congealing into psychic residue that found form and hunger. What we know is that wherever the choir appears, it leaves behind echoes that linger, sometimes for generations. They are not a single cult, but an infection of cults. Cells emerge independently across the galaxy, their doctrines unconnected, yet uncannily similar. They are drawn to ruin, to silence, to broken infrastructure. Their members tend to be outcasts, those who have lost not just status, but narrative. They are not rebels or heretics. They are the unwanted, the discarded, those whose grief has no vocabulary. The choir offers them a role, not to speak, but to resonate. The song is never heard in full. Instead, it manifests in fragments, a hum in a ventilation shaft, a pulse in a damaged cogitator, a rhythm in the scratching of rats across metal floors. Tech adepts investigating corrupted systems sometimes describe harmonic interference that turns error messages into lullabies. A data servitor on Gathalon 7 emitted a pattern of static clicks that, when mapped, formed a waveform identical to human weeping. No source was ever found. Some choirs make instruments, not crafted, but grown, through ritual, through decay, through warping the very environment into an extension of their song. On Dolmen Reach, investigators found an entire hab block transformed into a resonating chamber. Walls were covered in organic mesh, pulsating with low-frequency moans. Residents were found embedded in the floor, still alive, their lungs vibrating in unison. No two sang the same note. Together, they formed a cacophony that burrowed into the mind, peeling back the layers of thought until only emotion remained. Even more disturbing are the choir's human components. Recruits are not trained, but tuned. Through torturous processes, auditory deprivation, surgical alteration of the inner ear, implanting resonance nodules in the throat, they become living instruments. Their voices cease to express identity. They become notes, chords, movements. Inquisitorial reports speak of performances lasting hours, where hundreds of cultists sway and shudder in perfect synchronization, producing a sound that cannot be recorded but leaves listeners with nosebleeds, memory loss, or religious epiphany. The song spreads even when the cult does not. A ruined hive on Kelos Prime was abandoned after a plague killed 70% of the population. Years later, scavengers began reporting the hum. No words, no melody, just a persistent drone that made them weep or scream or pray. Vox logs captured nothing, but their behavior changed. They began leaving food offerings in symmetrical patterns. They stopped using language. They started to sing, not aloud, but in their sleep, in their movements, in the tremors of their hands. The Inquisition purged the site, but still, passing ships report interference in local Vox bands, patterns that match the DNA structures of native rodent species. Rats, always the rats. Where the choir appears, vermin population explodes. Not just rodents, but any creature small, hidden, and instinctive. They cluster near choir activity, as if drawn by resonance. It is from this that the cult gains its name. In the deeper lore of their own scripture, it is said that vermin were the first to hear the true music of the galaxy, that they alone survived the primordial dissonance, the great war of harmony that predated existence, and that through them, the choir sings anew. They are not aligned with chaos. If anything, the ruinous powers disdain them. Their resonance does not induce mutation or madness. It induces comprehension, terrible comprehension, of loss, of entropy, of the hollow echoing truth that all things end, and some endings never resolve. The choir does not serve a god. It serves the wound, the part of the galaxy that never healed, and its song is not to summon, but to remember. Remembering, after all, is a kind of worship, and forgetting is the true heresy. Deep beneath the crust of the Imperium's most bloated hive worlds, where the light of the Astronomicon cannot penetrate, and even the corpse god's name is a whisper of a whisper, the silence is alive. In those subterranean depths, where refuse flows thicker than water and the air tastes of rust and mildew, cults bloom like fungal growths. They do not gather in basilicas or shrines, but in broken cisterns, maintenance tunnels, and the hollowed skeletons of forgotten transit systems. Here, the liturgy is not spoken. It is chewed, gnawed, clicked in rhythms older than language. The choir's presence below cities is not metaphorical. It is literal. It is in the teeth marks on metal bulkheads, the patterns of infestation that appear like runes, the synchronized tapping of 1,000 vermin claws. Where one might expect the cults to dwell in silence, they instead revel in what can only be described as a primitive music, a mechanical, biological, chaotic song crafted from the detritus of civilization. They use broken vox throats not to communicate, but to harmonize. Their members are known to have cut their tongues to better whistle or sewn multiple larynxes into their chests. They walk like percussion instruments, each footstep part of a rhythm too vast to fully map. The hive city of Maldrith has long been a grave for psychers. Yet deep beneath its subsurface hab levels, survey teams discovered tunnels vibrating with inaudible frequencies. The team's Auspex gear picked up ghost harmonics, signals that should not exist, forming recursive patterns in perfect intervals. These were later matched to the emotional waveform of sorrow, an ancient method used by telepaths to record and broadcast feelings. Someone or something was singing sorrow itself. Not a word, not an idea, just the emotion, preserved and echoed endlessly. The cult beneath Maldrith called themselves the Submonics. They worshipped not with prayer, but by decaying in time. Every motion, every breath, every scab was part of a greater cadence. They didn't speak. Instead, they hummed through devices crafted from vox grills and the thoraxes of dead vermin. When an Inquisitorial kill team arrived, the cultists did not resist. They arranged themselves into a circle and began to tremble in sync. Within seconds, the team's psyker fell to her knees, eyes bleeding, muttering that she could feel her own death being written into her blood. The team retreated. Days later, the tunnel collapsed on its own. The choir had moved on. Not all choirs underground are so organized. Some are more like instinctive colonies than religious groups. On Vashtar Delta, local enforcers uncovered a network of feral children living beneath the city, led by a woman known only as the Vox Mother. She did not speak in words, but conducted her brood through gesture and sound. Her breath modulated like a wind instrument, capable of issuing orders in frequency ranges only children and vermin could hear. These children swarmed through the tunnels, reciting old nursery rhymes in reverse, their voices glitched by implanted Vox chips scavenged from the corpses of servitors. They had no creed, no mission, no prophecy, only performance. Performance, in fact, seems to be at the heart of these subterranean cults. They do not merely exist, they rehearse. Every tunnel becomes a venue, every infestation a chorus. Some even stage elaborate symphonies of decay, arranging refuse and corpses into massive acoustic traps. These generate sounds when the wind shifts, or when a pipe groans, or when a wall settles. To walk through these tunnels is to become part of the song, whether one wishes to or not. The songs themselves are often built from recurring motifs: the drone of broken machines, the hiss of chemical leaks, the screech of subway rails never used. These are the sacred sounds, not just remembered, but replicated. Cultists file their teeth to better mimic the scraping of bone. They carve holes in their skin to whistle through blood. Some have even replaced their bones with hollowed tubes to better serve as instruments in the choir's endless, slow-motion concert. On Ataraxis Prime, Hive-Bottom citizens began receiving dreams of music they could not forget. Entire blocks would awaken humming, unaware they were doing so. Suicide rates spiked. Productivity collapsed. The Administratum believed it was mass hysteria, until an Adeptus Mechanicus Magos traced the signal to a collapsed aquifer, where choir cultists had constructed a structure resembling a wind organ made from dead servitors. It was still breathing, its pipes inflating and deflating as though in mourning. No one had built it. It had grown. That's the truth that terrifies those who study the choir. It is not merely a group. It is a culture of resonance, a self-replicating network of behaviors and vibrations that echo wherever decay permits. Beneath cities, they are not the enemy of the Imperium. They are its shadow chorus. They play its failures like an instrument. Every lie told by the ecclesiarchy, every life ground to dust by the administratum, every scream lost in the vox static becomes a note in the choir's hymn. And the cities listen. They always listen. They do not register. Not on auspex. Not on the endless lists of threats tracked by the Ordo Hereticus. Not even in the oral lore whispered among acolytes and witch hunters who have seen too much. Whisper cults, as some call them, are beneath classification, too small, too subtle, too impermanent to warrant attention. And yet, they are felt. Their presence resonates through the warp, like frost creeping across a window, slow, silent, and spreading. These are the splinters of heresy so refined, so atomized that they infiltrate rather than explode. Their voices are not loud, but they are unrelenting. Among navigators and shipboard psychers, tales persist of sudden silences, not born of failure but presence. Moments where the Gellerfield hums off-key, or the stars outside the viewport blur for a fraction of a second into something like faces. The Void Watchers speak of entire crews who fall into synchronized muttering, uttering syllables that don't exist in any Imperial dialect. These are not possession events. No demons manifest. No rituals are found. But the songs linger. These whisper cults don't operate with hierarchy or structure. They flicker into existence like echoes of thought made flesh. a quartermaster begins rearranging supplies in patterns only visible from orbit. A medici begins prescribing placebos laced with subliminal harmonic triggers. A voidsman on a frigate paints identical symbols across decks in different languages, none of which he knows. These are not random acts. They are verses, stanzas in a galaxy-wide liturgy that no one consciously sings. But the warp hears, and it responds. Some of these cults arise from trauma. After the destruction of the Anthelian Gate, survivors aboard the rescue ships began experiencing identical dreams, caverns of bone where children sang in reverse. They awoke with bleeding ears and no memory of sleep. Within weeks, a new suborder of the Ecclesiarchy had formed aboard the flagship Divinum Los. They wore blindfolds and gloves made from vox cord and communicated by tapping their fingertips on metal surfaces. Each message, when decoded, formed part of a prayer that ended with the phrase, "We do not speak, for the wound has ears." Other whisper cults seem engineered. On the forge moon of Kyrion's shard, a batch of servitors began emitting tones in sequence that triggered deep nostalgia in nearby workers. Magi attempted to disable the servitors, only to find themselves caught in emotional fugue states, reliving the lives of people they never were. Eventually, the servitors were melted, but the tone persisted, now echoing through the very air systems. Workers began to murmur in their sleep, their breathing aligned. A new cult was born, not through ideology, but through acoustic contagion. These cults are incredibly difficult to extinguish because they lack center. Destroy the members, and their gestures remain in others. Silence the rituals, and the rhythm carries on in machines, in ventilation patterns, in the flickering of faulty lumen globes. Acolytes of the Ordo Malleus refer to them as resonant heresies, errors not of theology, but of frequency. These are wrong notes in the song of the Imperium, and they spread because the music is already so strained, so broken, that they slip in unnoticed. A particularly chilling case comes from the silent freighter Lucent Morning, which emerged from the warp, drifting, engines dead, no signs of life. Yet within its vox logs was a continuous low chant. No words, just breath, just breath. For 93 hours, recorded in perfect synchrony by hundreds of dead mouths. The crew had died weeks before emergence, but their bodies had continued to breathe in unison, as if waiting for an unseen conductor to cue the next line. The warp itself seems complicit. These cults do not call demons, but they disturb the veil, subtly. They amplify the static. They inject grief into the ship's AI. They leave crew members staring into empty corners, hearing music that makes them weep or laugh or remember names they never knew. They don't seek domination. They seek distribution. They exist in minds, in habits, in cultural noise. To catch them is to understand the shape of a shadow without seeing the object that casts it. There's a haunting theory whispered by rogue psychers that these cults are not separate, that they are all fragments of a single, omnipresent consciousness, perhaps a gestalt made of human pain, birthed by the Imperium's own nightmares. That every whisper cult, from the chanting orphans of Draxus 9 to the harmonized suicides of the Narthex fleet, is singing one note in a symphony composed by the galaxy's wounds. A music not yet complete, but growing louder with each forgotten world, each lost crew, each unnoticed ritual. They are not threats in the traditional sense. They do not overthrow governments or assassinate nobles, but they infect, they persist, they sing, not to anyone, just into the air, into the cracks, into us. And sometimes, when the room is silent, we might just hum along without knowing why. In the irradiated, wind-scarred ash wastes of forgotten worlds, where the ruins of failed colonies lie half-buried beneath mountains of soot, broken saints wander. Their skin is cracked like old porcelain. Their eyes burn with phosphorescent memory. And though their tongues are often severed or fused by ritual, their message is unmistakable. These are the broken saints, outcasts, mutants, war criminals, and failed prophets who found something in the wastes. Not salvation, not redemption, something colder, something deeper. They found song. These wastes are death zones. Even Vox signals barely function here. Radiation eats through armor in days. The winds carry static and machine filth. Yet, within these forbidden grounds, scattered cults continue to thrive, not in strength, but in endurance. They live by rhythms no sane mind can follow. Their gatherings are not organized. They coalesce like dust devils, appearing and dissolving with the pulse of ancient trauma. The saints who lead them do not command. They embody. They are living litanies, moving to a beat embedded in flesh, in pain, in memory. One such figure is Saint Dravel of the Ash Choir. His lungs were replaced with fluted brass, each breath a painful hymn. He was found by scavengers walking a perfect spiral around a dead reactor, his footsteps aligned with magnetic pulses emitted once every 39 seconds. No food, no water, just a song of decay. The cult that followed him mimicked his spiral until their legs broke from overuse. They crawled after him anyway. When interrogated, one member wept, not from pain, but from the beauty of the sound he had heard vibrating in his jawbone. The broken saints do not found cults in the traditional sense. They catalyze them. Like a resonance chamber, they shape the ambient despair of the wastes into meaning. Often, these saints are the only point of coherence in an environment that otherwise resists pattern. On Cole's breath, a dead moon poisoned by centuries of chemical bombardment, a blind woman known as the Glass Penitent was discovered sitting at the center of a crater, her skin laced with circuitry and scarred with ancient musical notation. She did not speak, but every day at dusk, a chorus of dust would rise around her, forming brief silhouettes that moved in perfect choreography before collapsing into nothing. Locals began calling her the Conductor, and pilgrims walked for weeks just to weep in her presence. Some saints emerged from imperial punishment. Penal battalions sent to uninhabitable zones sometimes leave survivors too altered by radiation or psychic exposure to return. These soldiers become relics, half human, half emotion, wandering the wastes as if drawn by some internal orchestra. On Dremel's scar, 3 such survivors were found crucified on metallic trees grown by unknown technology. They were humming in unison, despite having no tongues, no sign of restraint. They had chosen this. The sound they made caused auditory hallucinations in nearby troops, visions of fire, glass, and children laughing in reverse. The common thread among these wasteland cults is that they interpret suffering not as punishment, but as harmony. Pain becomes proof of participation in the great unseen composition of the galaxy. These saints preach not with doctrine, but with presence. Their movements, their wounds, their very silence becomes scripture. One heretic philosopher described them as the punctuation marks in the galaxy's suicide note. And yet, their followers find purpose, clarity even, in that bleakness. They do not want salvation. They want to be in tune. Costume and ritual vary, but often feature elements of distortion. Broken Vox helms filled with static crystals, skin flayed into sigils, vocal cords replaced with brass wire. On Varnak's maw, the order of the final timbre coats itself in ash and glass. They do not speak. They rub their teeth together to generate harmonics, aligning with tectonic tremors beneath the planet. Their high priest is deaf, blind, and immobile, yet cultists claim to hear his voice echo from mountains when the wind is right. Whether truth or delusion, it changes nothing. They believe, and belief in the wastes is a weapon. Occasionally, these cults migrate, not to spread, but to fulfill prophecy. Self-written prophecies that speak of tonal convergence, of voices aligning across worlds to awaken the Great Rest, a mythic event where all sound will stop permanently. When they travel, they leave trails not of destruction, but of harmony. Hab blocks echo with refrains long after they've passed. Children begin to hum. Rust arranges itself into symbols. Even Vox ghosts start whispering the same refrains. The Imperium largely ignores these saints and their ashen choirs. They are too far removed, too scattered, too mad. And yet, there's a quiet fear among the Inquisition that something is being orchestrated, not in space, but in culture, in perception. A galaxy slowly being tuned. The saints may not know the melody, but they feel it. They are the dissonant prophets of a final silence, wandering the wastes, singing with their wounds. And in their suffering, they echo the fate of humanity itself. In the hidden vaults of derelict manufactorums, in the basements of fallen cathedrals and the meat-stinking underlevels of renegade worlds, there lie devices so vile and fascinating that they defy classification. They are not machines in the true sense, nor are they instruments in any civilized definition. They are the choir's instruments, creations of sinew and scrap, of wire and weeping, of trauma made audible. Not merely tools of heresy, but relics of an art form that blends music with suffering until they are indistinguishable. These instruments do not require skill to play, they require agony. A flensing harp from the Void Hulk Silent Opus was recovered by a salvage crew who found a single survivor bound within it. His vocal cords had been fed through the strings. The instrument sang when he sobbed, tuned to his despair. The notes it produced were mathematically precise, yet emotionally ruinous, psychoacoustic waves that induced hallucinations in the crew and drove 2 men to suicide. The harp had no power source. It fed on breath, on dread. The man died when they tried to free him. The harp fell silent, and then, days later, began to hum again on its own. In the Ash Choir's vaults beneath Verelium Reach, they maintain what they call the Vox Infanta, an array of vox casters surgically fused into the lungs of a choir of mutant children. Each child's ribs are wired into a resonant chamber that amplifies their scream into a harmony. They do not cry out randomly. Their tones align, alter, blend, echo. Witnesses say it feels less like hearing a sound and more like having your soul scraped gently across steel. The Vox Infanta requires constant maintenance. If one child dies, the song fractures. But the cult sees this not as tragedy, but modulation. Death is just another key change. Other instruments blur the line between ritual and biology. The choir of the fused throat on Hive Gethril has cultivated a machine made from living throats and vox boxes. Each new recruit has a piece of their vocal tract removed and fed into the choir core, which grows with each offering. The resulting structure looks like a tumor woven from chrome and blood, pulsing with rhythmic sound. It doesn't speak. It repeats, only phrases that never had meaning in the first place. Palindromic fragments, recursive syllables, and forgotten names. One phrase was recorded during a purge. We remember the silence that followed the first scream. The choir's instruments are not limited to fixed locations. Some are ambulatory, living constructs that carry their song across the wastes. On Aspects Ultima, a biomechanical creature roams the ash fields. Its body is a patchwork of servitor remains and animal sinew, with dozens of throats wired into a central vox core. It emits low, mournful drones that cause spontaneous bleeding in nearby fauna. When approached, it reacts not with violence, but modulation, tuning itself to the emotion of the intruder. Some say it weeps when surrounded by sadness. Others claim it laughs, a deep vibrato that shatters glass when it smells blood. And then there are the silent instruments, those that emit no sound but still perform. The reflection spiral found on Dolmeth's Echo is a series of polished metal mirrors arranged in a perfect helical arc. When walked through, pilgrims report hearing memories they never lived. It does not resonate with sound, but with self, generating personalized symphonies drawn from the viewer's trauma. Inquisitors who tried to catalog it suffered identity fragmentation, hearing voices in their own mind saying things they never knew they believed. Many of these creations defy understanding because they do not merely express feeling, they transmit it, not as metaphor, but as vector. Just as disease moves through air or fluid, so too does despair through these instruments. They weaponize the emotive potential of music and transform it into a communicable state. Exposure leads not to madness, but transformation. Minds bend toward the choir, not because they are compelled, but because they understand. The music makes sense in a way nothing else ever has, and always behind these instruments is the notion of beauty. Not traditional beauty, not harmony or elegance, but the sublime, the aesthetic of the unbearable. The way rot glistens in sunlight, the way a scream can be beautiful if it lasts long enough. The choir understands that the universe is not held together by laws or faith, but by suffering, resonant, rhythmic suffering. Their instruments do not merely illustrate that truth, they celebrate it. For in the end, sound is the perfect medium for heresy. It leaves no fingerprints, it cannot be burned, and once heard, it echoes forever. Aboard the derelicts of forgotten crusades, where the banners of the Imperium still hang limp in vacuum-sealed chapels, there lingers a silence that is anything but empty. It is the silence of memory, of failure, of song unfinished. And in some of these drifting tombs, the song has changed, twisted by pain, molded by loss, made holy by despair. These are the echoes from lost crusades, a resonance formed not by triumph, but by entropy. Choirs born not from hope, but from the echo of hope betrayed. These are not the grand traders of recorded heresy. These are the remnants, the unfinished verses of campaigns erased from official record. Astartes who heard something on the edge of a cursed world and never quite recovered. Imperial Guard companies who began marching in lockstep to rhythms no officer taught them. Ecclesiarchs who returned with litanies no book ever held, their voices harmonizing with the flickering of failing Geller fields. They did not fall to chaos, they fell to resonance. One such force was the 9th Jericho Expedition, sent to pacify the warp-rent zone known as the Cradle Maw. No full report was ever returned. But decades later, the derelict cruiser Pax Benediction was found adrift on the outer edge of Segmentum Pacificus. Boarding parties discovered its crew frozen mid-motion, some in worship, others in dance. The ship's Vox systems were filled with a continuous, looping chant in no known tongue. The pitch increased with each rotation of the vessel. Within 3 days, the boarding team joined the pose. They were spaced for quarantine, but the Vox signal continued. It still does. There are whispers of whole fleets that turned inward mid-campaign, abandoning conquests to drift into the void. The Iron Word of Palantheus was a minor crusade fleet, mostly Guard with Mechanicus support, that lost its final war on the soil of Virex IV. But the Mechanicus warbark Cantor Prime was found decades later, its decks scoured, its engines dormant. Inside, the walls had been carved with rows upon rows of phonetic symbols. A linguist identified the sequence as musical notation, primitive but precise. The conclusion? The dead crew had tried to transcribe something they heard in the silence after their defeat. A last hymn, a sonic legacy etched into steel. Among these lost crusaders, there is often a pattern of behavioral collapse, not into madness, but into ritual. They begin to synchronize, not in action, but in emotional affect. They weep in chorus. They breathe in patterns. Their laughter becomes infectious, not because of joy, but because of structure. On the derelict colony ship Sanctum's Remorse, salvagers encountered a unit of Imperial Guard who had survived decades in the cold void. Malnourished and mute, they communicated entirely through rhythmic drumming on their armor. Their leader, a former Vox operator, had a second heart installed in his neck, pulsing in counterpoint to his own. It was unclear if this was surgical or spontaneous. No survivors made it back. It is said some of these echo choirs remain in service to the Imperium, if only technically. The monastic dead of the Icarian clade are a known, though rarely acknowledged, auxiliary unit. They occupy a derelict Gloriana-class vessel too damaged for warp travel. They do not speak. They do not sleep. They harmonize. Every 3 standard days, they transmit a song across the void, faint, encoded in lost dialects, but always ending with the same phrase. We have become the memory of war. The Ordo Malleus believes they are a living containment mechanism. Others suspect they are a seed of something far older, waiting to bloom. The most terrifying thing is that these echoes are not always static. Some crusades appear to have returned deliberately infected, turned by something they encountered, yet not chaotic, not demonic. Their ship logs speak of music and architecture, of shrines that vibrated like gongs, of enemies who sang themselves to death. On the campaign to cleanse the Tundex halls, an entire battalion was reportedly silenced by a single drone, emitted from a temple built entirely from vocal cords. The survivors returned altered, no longer speaking in Imperial Gothic, but in tones that mimicked machinery and wind. They were reassigned, then vanished from all records. Even more haunting are those who resist the choir, but still echo it. Astartes veterans from the culling of Shireen Primus report hearing harmonies during prayer that do not belong in any catechism. They weep without cause. Their armor resonates during warp travel. They claim no heresy, yet the chaplains have begun isolating them, not out of punishment, out of reverence. Because in those echoes lies a truth the Imperium is not ready to face, that some songs are stronger than loyalty. The choir does not need to recruit. It only needs to be heard. And the lost crusades, those voices muffled by bureaucracy, erased by shame, are the perfect vessels. They return not as victors, but as verses, as memory made flesh, as harmony in decay. And they sing still across the void, even when no one is left to listen. There are melodies in this galaxy that do not entertain, that do not elevate, that do not bring joy or catharsis. There are songs that kill, songs that ruin, songs that hollow out cities and eat away at minds like rust in the soul. These are the hymns of the litany of rot, the weapons of the choir in its most virulent form. Not metaphorical infections, but literal ones, waves of sound that transmit despair, plague, and dissolution, not through biological means, but through resonance. They begin small, a whisper in the vox during Mass, a minor deviation in the pitch of a city's warning sirens, an abnormal reverb in the chiming of a bell. The Imperium, so accustomed to malfunction, rarely notices the first signs. But then people start acting differently. They begin humming in unison. Food tastes like ash, dreams sink across populations, and then the rot begins, not in flesh, but in identity. The most infamous case is the Melancholia event of Baranthia Tertius. The planet was a compliant world, pious and stable, until during a routine ecclesiarchal service, the choir struck a note that had never been written. The sound was minor, slightly off, but the congregation began to weep, not from sadness, from recognition. That note was remembered. It wasn't new. It had always been there. The choir couldn't stop singing it. Within days, suicides tripled. A week later, the population began to decay. Not physically, socially. Families dissolved. Names were forgotten. Bureaucracies crumbled as clerks could no longer recall their duties. By the time the Inquisition intervened, only 7% of the population still remembered the God Emperor's name. The Litany of Rot is not a fixed chant. It is a process, a progression of auditory vectors that corrode human meaning. Each verse targets a different layer of consciousness. The first verse disorients. The second erases. The third inverts. The fourth calcifies. The fifth, no one knows. No one survives the fifth. On the hive world of Reductus 5, a miners' union stumbled upon a collapsed sub-level where a functioning Vox tower emitted a single tone. It was described as a minor key inside the bones. Anyone within proximity began to speak in mirrored sentences, their language reversed, yet retained coherence. They could no longer think forward. Ritual suicides began as miners walked into active plasma ducts, humming a melody no one could place. Those who were pulled back screamed not in pain, but in protest. They wanted to finish the song. The plague on Venth's Hollow was a different mutation of the litany. It traveled through Hab speakers. It was quiet, barely more than a fluctuation in white noise. But it tuned itself to emotional frequency. Each citizen heard the sound they most feared. Some heard laughter, others crying, still others the absence of a sound they desperately needed. It drove men mad with guilt, women to stab their own ears. Children began to sing lullabies that did not rhyme. The Administratum thought it was mimetic warfare until the Magos dissected the Vox system and found no flaw. The sound was not being broadcast. It was being grown. There are notes in the litany that should not be possible, frequencies that do not exist within the human capacity to produce. Yet cultists shape themselves to emit them. Through surgery, through mutation, through sacred self-harm, they become living speakers of death. One cult on Harrowine Delta replaced their spines with organ pipes. They walked through cities, exhaling cords that caused iron to rust and tears to flow. A single verse turned ag-rehabs to sludge, not by chemical contamination, but by memory deletion. The crops forgot how to grow. The psychological impact of the litany is as terrifying as its physical toll. It does not incite rebellion or chaos. It dissolves initiative. It inspires nothing. It makes people passive, compliant, hollow. Entire garrisons have surrendered without conflict, not out of fear, but because they could no longer see the point. Priests begin quoting contradictory scripture. Tech priests forget prayers of activation. Commissars weep during executions. The music doesn't argue. It simply replaces. The Ordo Malleus classifies outbreaks as anathema incantations. They are not destroyed but quarantined. Some are even studied. There are whispers that certain inquisitors have memorized fragments of the litany, believing they can use it against chaos or xeno-psi constructs. But the danger lies not in misuse. It lies in hearing. Once it is heard, truly heard, it is never silent again. Because the litany of rot is not just song. It is a state of being, a resonance that echoes the galaxy's fundamental wound. It doesn't create despair. It reveals it. And in doing so, it makes everyone who hears it complicit in their own dissolution. They say the stars are silent, but that is only because we have forgotten how to listen. There are things the Inquisition notices. Heresies with names and banners, armies that roar as they burn, sorceries that light up the warp like flares in a storm. These, the Inquisition addresses with the full fury of the God Emperor's will. But there are also things it hears and pretends not to. Songs without lyrics, cults without leaders, mass forgettings, patterns in Vox static. These are the quiet things, the whispered heresies, the songs sung by the choir. And sometimes the Inquisition does nothing. Sometimes it listens. Sometimes it lets the song play. This is the unspoken horror, that some within the Ordos not only tolerate the Vermin choir, but use it. A rumor, of course. A theory whispered by rogue archivists and dying acolytes. But it persists. Why else would a choir cult be allowed to grow beneath an entire hive city before being accidentally discovered by a mid-tier Arbites? Why else would records of the choir's influence vanish from multiple sectors, always after contact with Inquisitorial agents? The truth is likely more complex and more terrifying. Not all Inquisitors serve the same vision. Ordo Hereticus may see the choir as emotional heresy. Ordo Malleus might view them as warp artifacts. But there are those in the Ordo Xenos and Ordo Chronos who consider the choir to be something else entirely, a reflection of the galaxy's own subconscious, a cultural immune response, a symptom, not a disease. And if it is a symptom, then perhaps it tells us something we are not supposed to hear. Among radical factions like the Reconsecrators or the Xanthites, there exists a philosophy that the choir is not corruption, but data, that their hymns represent encoded truths buried in galactic history, truths the Emperor himself may have known, and which were hidden for our own good. These Inquisitors don't destroy choir cults. They observe, record, experiment. A cell of the Vermin choir on Atraxis IV was left to fester for 7 years under Inquisitor Hallis Thorn. During that time, he personally oversaw the construction of a resonance vault, an acoustic trap designed to capture the cult's harmonic code. He vanished 2 years later. The vault still hums. Other factions believe the choir is the lesser of many evils. In a galaxy where chaos spreads like wildfire, perhaps a heresy that consumes without violence is preferable. Some choirs bring peace, not hope, not joy, but quiet. Planets consumed by the choir often report an end to war, to crime, even to political dissent. At what cost? Identity, emotion, soul. But to an Inquisitor tasked with maintaining control, that might be acceptable collateral. Then there are the Black Archives, places even other Inquisitors cannot enter. One such vault, known as Echo Drone Theta 7, allegedly contains a complete symphony composed by a choir-infused machine spirit. Its harmonic signature is said to erase the concept of enemy from those who hear it. Useful in a war, dangerous in a galaxy, but too valuable to destroy. Why does the Inquisition allow these cults to spread? Because not all heresy looks like fire. Some heresy looks like knowledge, like control, like options. There's a theory that the Inquisition has tried to weaponize the choir, that certain accidental broadcasts across penal colonies or doomed war zones were trials, that choir resonance might be used to pacify insubordinate worlds, calm revolts, or even disrupt chaos rituals. Sound is faster than thought. What better way to purge dissent than to override it? But the choir resists domestication. Inquisitors who linger near their songs grow introspective, cold, quiet. They begin to act without explanation. They stop praying. They start humming. Some disappear entirely, their last Vox entries filled with recursive phrases. One report ends with the line, "We are not lost. We are remembered. We are becoming the silence that holds the stars." This is the fear, that the choir is not an enemy at all, but a direction, that the galaxy is slowly, inevitably tuning itself to their frequency, that the Emperor's light, flickering and choked by bureaucracy, may be dimming into harmony rather than chaos. The choir doesn't seek to overthrow the Imperium, it seeks to become its new rhythm. So the Inquisition listens, and sometimes it does not intervene, not out of ignorance, not out of weakness, but out of hope, or despair, or curiosity, because perhaps in the end, they too want to hear what the galaxy is trying to sing. They are not gone. They were never gone. The choir was never truly forgotten, never entirely buried beneath the layers of sanctioned history or silenced beneath the scream of bolter fire. Their songs linger in the pauses between transmissions, in the breath before prayer, in the quiet after slaughter. The galaxy is wounded, and the choir, those cults, those echoes, those vermin lullabies, they are the scar tissue singing to us still, not to recruit, not to lead, but to be remembered, to remind us of what we are, broken things pretending to be whole. You feel it, don't you? When you stare too long into the static of a damaged Vox screen, when the wind shifts in an abandoned shrine and you hear nothing, and that nothing feels like music. When your dreams carry a rhythm you cannot place, but you wake with tears anyway. You've heard them. So have I. Not always with ears, but with the marrow, with the ache behind the eyes, with the chill beneath devotion. We who hear them still are not heretics. We are witnesses to a deeper truth, a second gospel written not in scripture but in dissonance. The Imperium hides behind noise, war cries, engines, endless sermons, but the choir finds the cracks, and in those cracks it sings, softly, relentlessly. A melody stitched from suffering and entropy, a symphony not of rebellion, but of realization. There are times when I wonder if the Emperor himself hears it, not as an affront, but as an echo of what he could not save. For even a god figure must sometimes mourn. Perhaps that is why he is silent. Perhaps he listens too. So listen, not with obedience, not with fear, but with reverence. For the choir is not evil, it is honest. Its song does not promise hope, it promises memory, that nothing will be forgotten, that every scream, every failed crusade, every child swallowed by a hive's undergut will be remembered in sound. We who hear them still do not raise banners. We do not proselytize. We simply pause, and in the pause, we let the song fill us. A song of sorrow, a song of beauty, a song that binds all broken things together in one final resonant sigh. And if you, traveler, have felt that same hum in your bones, then perhaps you are one of us. Not a cultist, not a heretic, just aware. The galaxy wounds itself with every breath, and somewhere beneath the hollow moons, the Vermin choir sings to those wounds still. If this journey through the forgotten and the unseen stirred something in you, if you heard the song between the words, then stay with us. Subscribe, and let these forbidden echoes reach others. Let us hear together, remember together, resonate together. The choir is not done, and neither are we.